Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Donald Trump's second State of the Union address was conspicuously light when it came to foreign policy. Why is this? Was his aim to avoid disappointing his base while at the same time wishing not to spar with the deep state? What are these mixed signals all about? Is it an elaborate strategy or an indication of indecisiveness? Cross-talking U.S. foreign policy, I'm joined by my guest, Brian Becker in Washington. He's the director of the Answer Coalition, as well as host of Loud and Clear, a daily news show on Radio Sputnik. Also in Washington, we have John Sitilides. He is a geopolitical strategist at Trilogy Advisors. And in Auburn, we cross to Lou Rockwell. He is a political analyst at LouRockwell.com. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Brian, let me go to you first. I'll just kind of throw my introduction at you again. Trump wasn't really heavy on the foreign policy, though I give him kudos. I thought it was a very conciliatory address, considering it came from Donald Trump. But let's stay with foreign policy. He didn't talk much about it. Is it because he didn't want to disappoint his base and he didn't want to spar with the deep state, which he's had a lot of problems with, even individuals very close to him in his own administration? And I'm talking specifically one instance like taking troops out of Syria and Afghanistan. What was your take? Go ahead, Brian.
Well, the foreign policy part of the speech came after, I think, an hour and 10 minutes. It was a long speech. It was like an hour and 24 minutes. So, yeah, it was stocked at the end with foreign policy issues that had to do with Syria, had to do with Afghanistan, had to do with Korea, Iran, Russia. Important big issues. But again, as you said, Peter, they came very towards the end of the speech and not too long on it. I think the Soto speech, the State of the Union address, was basically the kickoff of Donald Trump's 2020 election campaign. This election will not be decided on foreign policy issues, and as a consequence, he focused on two things. He focused on immigration, because that's the play to his political base, and also he's trying to present the Democratic Party as socialist, which is kind of silly, but may work as a political electoral device, because it's the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party that could actually defeat Donald Trump, competing with him for some of the same voters. So he's trying to ostracize socialism. He resolved that America will never become a socialist country, which I don't think any president in recent history has said to the American people, we reject the road of socialism. It wasn't really on the table. But nonetheless, I think parts of the foreign policy speech were significant. He said the U.S. is leaving Syria. He wrongly claimed credit for the defeat of ISIS. That wasn't the American presence. He said the U.S. was going to negotiate with the Taliban. He spoke positively about the Taliban's desire for peace. That shows a desire on the Trump White House, on the part of the Trump White House, to actually end the war. In the case of Venezuela, he's like, I'm naming the new president of Venezuela. Of course, the U.S. government does not have that right. Well, that's not how it works. And in the case of Korea,
all I can say is bad habits die hard.
In the case of Korea, indeed. I mean, that's the part of the continuity of the Trump administration. American presidents have been overthrowing other sovereign governments for a very long time. That's not something new.
Okay. John, let me go to you. Let me quote President Trump a few lines from his address here. Foolish wars, politics, and ridiculous partisan investigations are the only obstacles to the miracle of American economic growth. And he went on to say, if there's going to be peace and legislation, there must not be war and investigation. It just doesn't work that way. I find that you are kind of a mixed salad of a lot of different things simultaneously at the same time. Go ahead, John.
Well, I think one of the reasons why the president kept a foreign policy and national security aspects of the speech towards the latter part is because the astonishing success of his economic policies have largely gone unmentioned in U.S. media that's been focused on a whole host of so-called scandalous activity, none of which has come to fruition and which really doesn't exist. And so he's taken the time to remind or to inform most Americans that, in fact, the economy is red hot, as he described it. We have record low unemployment, not only on a national level, but for important constituencies that have suffered from high unemployment or from high unemployment in prior years. and also the fact that this is really a middle-class and working-class issue for the American people. And I think he really wanted to emphasize that more than anything else. So this is where I think the priority is, and most American voters, as most voters in most countries around the world, care primarily about their standard of living, about their quality of life. Yes, they want to know that their country is safe from enemies abroad and close to home, and that's why I think it was prioritized the way that it was. But the bulk of this is going to be on what the president is trying to do and what he has accomplished and will try to continue to accomplish, and to minimize a lot of these distractions that the media here has largely focused on, but have kept many voters uninformed about the tremendous economic progress of the last 2 years.
Well, John, I absolutely agree with you on that. I mean, the reporting, it's almost non-existent, okay? But let me go to Auburn. Lou, I still want to stay with the foreign policy thing here, because I think it was intentional, because Trump has found himself in a lot of hot water with people very, very close with him, contradicting him, interpreting his words, shifting policy. Syria is the perfect example. At the end of December, we're getting out of Syria, and then you have Pompeo and Bolton going on Middle East tours saying, well, it's not really exactly what he means. He kind of means this or that. I mean, basically putting words in the president's mouth. And the reason why I mention this, because there is a part of his base that want these foreign wars to come to an end. And he's trying to honor that, while at the same time meddling in the affairs of Venezuela in the most obtrusive and well, amazingly transparent way. I mean, this is a coup that is being just advertised in broad daylight. Go ahead, Lou, in Auburn.
Well, you know, when it comes to Syria, yes, he said he's going to get the troops out. But when he was at the AIPAC meeting in Washington, he said, I'm not going to get the troops out. They need to be there to protect Israel from Iran. Of course, a nonsensical statement.
Whatever that means. Yeah.
You know, even his statement about great nations don't fight endless wars, as he examined Rome or Britain, or for that matter, American history. But one very interesting thing, when the cameras panned to the generals after he made that comment, they were looking at him with pure hate. So I thought if he had any brains, he would get rid of these generals and promote more pro-peace guys, or at least non-warmongering guys from lower in the ranks, because these generals, with their gigantic number of decorations, I guess self-awarded decorations, hate his guts. They hate the idea of peace. They hate the idea of any kind of detente with anybody. And as long as they're there, it seems to me that's a huge problem for him. Not only Bolton, not only the civilian people in the White House, but the military people, too.
Okay, you know, Brian, the interesting thing is you know, when we mentioned Bolton and Pompeo, okay, I think it's quite clear that they're interventionists to the core, have a very deep and abiding respect for American exceptionalism. But Donald Trump is America first. And can they coexist? Can they work together? Because the more you think about it, the more they're very contradictory. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, well, you see in the case of Korea, let's turn to Korea, for instance. I mean, Donald Trump is personally committed, I believe, to coming up with a peace deal with the DPRK. And he set the second summit. If it wasn't for Trump himself, and I'm not a fan of Trump, but if it wasn't for Trump himself, this process would not be going forward, because it's not just Bolton, it's the entire political establishment here in Washington, Democrat and Republican and the military, that's actually against a peace deal in Korea. They prefer the status quo. It provides a pretext for endless spending. It's not just endless war, but endless spending of American tax dollars on military things. And of course, it projects American power into South Korea in a very direct way, with 30,000 U.S. troops that continue to occupy the country. Trump wants this deal, though. Now, Bolton has tried to sabotage it. He said in the beginning, remember, he said, well, Libya should be the model for the DPRK. And the DPRK is like, what? That ended up with the execution of the head of state. So then the DPRK canceled the next meetings. I think then Trump intervened and said, look, we're going to actually go along with the DPRK posture on negotiations, which means denuclearization comes as a process, as a step-by-step negotiating pattern, and that while North Korea offers concessions, the U.S. must do the same. There must be a process leading to, first, the normalization of relations, the end of the Korean War, and then the talk about real denuclearization. You can't ask North Korea to disarm and at the same time refuse to end the war from 1950 to 53. Nobody disarms when a war is still happening. The only way you start to reduce weapons is if you say peace is coming. And Trump appears to have accepted this notion, which I think is key to having a changed relationship on the Korean Peninsula between the two Koreas and between the U.S. and North Korea.
John, reflect upon that there, because does his foreign policy team, and we'll use the example of the Korean Peninsula, do they want their own president to succeed?
First of all, let me just offer a different premise for this larger discussion, if I might, Peter.
Go ahead.
The reason that countries such as China and Russia and Iran, countries that are opposed to U.S. national interests on a global scale, have been able to prosper over the last 25 to 30 years is at the U.S. taxpayer expense, for a Navy that's provided open shipping lanes for commerce, for trade, for relations under a rules-based order that seems to be upended by a number of powers around the world.
Okay.
And so, there are criticisms to be had. Pardon me, let me finish my statement. There are criticisms to be had.
That's rules-based? That's rules-based? Yes. The destruction of Libya?
Yes, you're right. We'll talk about Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and eastern Ukraine as well.
Presence in Syria, these are the correct international norms? I'm sorry, that doesn't make any sense.
We can devote hours to each of these issues. All I want to present is a different premise than what your other panelists have. That's all. For the way the international order has been able to prosper, including for countries that remain adamantly opposed to U.S. national interests. So just want to put that out there for the record.
Okay,
on North Korea, I think that the U.S.
I have to go to a hard break here. After a short break, we'll continue our discussion on U.S. foreign policy. Stay with our team. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. To remind you, we're discussing U.S. foreign policy. Okay, let's go back to John in Washington. I want to reiterate that I do agree with you what you said. You know, we could have very long discussions on the nature of the international order, but I would like to focus on Trump's foreign policy and the obstacles he faces, because I think there's no doubt. You know, you have both houses of Congress passing non-binding resolutions, but very public, that they do not want the president to have his own foreign policy and hemming him in all the way around. Now, I don't like all of those ideas, but there are certain prerogatives the president has, and traditionally anyway, and there's a good part or some part of his political base that supports it. That's why they voted for him. So it seems to me there's an unprecedented move to box in a president, not to move towards peace. Go ahead, John.
That's a very important point that you raised, Peter. And look, there's a healthy debate inside the Republican Party about how activist the foreign policy of the United States should be. And there are many people, unfortunately for them today in Washington, D.C., Republicans who are known as never-Trumpers, about 150 or so, who signed the famous letter in March of 2016 denouncing then-candidate Donald Trump as a potential president of the United States. And they're all outside the box now, with really no role to play directly in the formulation of U.S. foreign policy. But the debate is taking place between the White House and the Senate and House leadership. But I think more importantly among the American people, many of whom are tired, as the president stated, of endless wars. The president's a businessman. He's not a typical politician. In his mind, you start a project and you finish it. You don't just have it going on continuously if there's no end in sight. However, he is very clear that he is going to be maintaining a presence in the Middle East, not so much for Israel alone, but really because the U.S. considers Iran to be a major national security threat. So even when there's a healthy debate about Syria and Afghanistan, there's very little debate about the Trump administration's policies against Iran.
Okay, so Lou, what is the national security risk that the United States faces from Iran? Because I hear it all the time, but no one has ever given me any evidence. Give me some evidence. Go ahead.
It's justifying imperialism. It's just baloney. Iran is a small, poor country. They've got a lot of people, but economically they're small. They're militarily small. But Israel wants to destroy them. This is why Trump is keeping his troops in Syria. So he said at AIPAC. So I think Iran is no threat to anybody. poor Iran. I mean, have they invaded anybody recently? I mean, this is unlike the U.S. They're not an aggressive power. The U.S., of course, invades all over the world. How many millions of people, by the way, has the U.S. killed over all the centuries? And it's all its wars, its occupations, its invasions. It's horrific. And we're supposed to believe that the U.S., of course, is maintaining an international rules-based order just out of the goodness of its heart, not because and of course that's why it should be in control of the South China Sea and every other place every other piece of water in the world. So this is just propaganda. Some of us thought that President Trump would be a different kind of president. I'd love to see it. I hope he actually takes the troops out of Syria. Hope he makes peace in Afghanistan and gets the heck out of there and stops killing people there. I hope he gets out of Iraq, although, of course, Israel doesn't want him getting out of Iraq. And they also not want him to get out of Syria because they want to keep control of the Golan Heights without any problem. So I'm afraid that the fact that he owes so much to Sheldon Adelson and other huge donors of his means maybe he's not going to do this. As to the Never Trumpers, he told us he would never have these sorts of people in his administration. There they are. They're all over the place. So is he weak? Is he actually a phony? I don't know. Yeah. I'd love to see him do something. He is the president. He can actually tell the military to get out of Syria. He can tell them to get out of Afghanistan. And the only negotiation he needs is to ask the Taliban, don't harry our troops as we move out, which they would be happy to agree to. Same in Syria. So, and also, of course, South Korea would like us out of South Korea.
Yep.
They don't. Many South Korean prime ministers have not wanted the U.S. in South Korea. The present one doesn't want us here. U.S. works very hard to keep that from happening, wants to occupy South Korea, and it's very expensive, terrible. It's a terrible thing. The U.S. should get out of South Korea and let South Korea and North Korea negotiate their own deal.
Work it out themselves, and they're actually doing that.
That's exactly right.
You know, Brian, what was your reaction to Elliot Abrams being made point man for Venezuela? I mean, I'm glad I wasn't sitting on a tall bar stool because I probably would have hurt myself because I was astounded, stunned. What was your reaction?
Well, Elliot Abrams' appointment was a clear signal from the Trump administration and from Bolton, and they all go back a long time. I mean, Elliot Abrams is a convicted felon. He lied to Congress. He violated U.S. laws to maintain the Iran-Contra arms sales to counter-revolutionary Somoza National Guardsmen who functioned as the security forces for the Somoza dictatorship before the revolution in '79. Elliot Abrams has been carrying out and exercising regime change options in Latin America. He's a main primary hawk to overthrow the Cuban government. You had John Bolton at the same time talking about the troika of tyranny, reminding us of Ronald Reagan's axis, the evil empire, and George W. Bush's axis of evil in 2000 before the invasion of Iraq. Elliot Abrams is a clear signal that the U.S. is probably going to go to war against Venezuela, especially if their coup plans don't work out. I believe that's what's on the agenda. Elliot Abrams is there for one purpose and one purpose alone, and that's to initiate a confrontation with Venezuela. That's very dangerous. Even though the Venezuelan government is mired in a profound economic crisis and facing enormous economic sanctions, the people of Venezuela, including many people in the opposition, don't fancy a war. They don't fancy the United States dictating who their government's going to be. They don't look kindly at the right-wing Colombian government with its paramilitaries beginning to carrying out skirmishing activities, which will be a pretext at the border. That's very, very serious. This could blow up in the United States. Mexico, Uruguay, Bolivia, of course, Cuba are standing with Venezuela. The Lima Group is basically functioning as a proxy or as an extension of American power. Again, the U.S. has no legal right to carry out the overthrow of a sovereign government. You know, when Venezuela has elections in the and the opposition wins, the government recognizes that when the government wins, which is more frequently, the opposition always says it's fraud and becomes a pretext then for U.S. intervention.
Or they just don't participate. John, I mean, if there's a impending intervention into Venezuela, would it be wise to ponder the interventions of Afghanistan, of Iraq, of Syria, of Libya, overthrowing the legal government in Ukraine? It didn't work out too well for half of the country, at least here. I mean, is there ever any introspection, or is it, do they think that, this time it will be different? How many times can you say that and think it might happen? Go ahead, John.
I don't envision any type of military intervention in the crisis in Venezuela. As a matter of fact, your other panelists mentioned the Lima Group. It's unfortunate that he denigrated the good diplomatic efforts of many Latin American countries to try to achieve a peaceful resolution of the crisis in Venezuela. And the United States is working with most of its Latin American allies and now with key European Union countries to try to see if there's a peaceful transition away from, unfortunately, for the panelists, a fraudulent government under Nicolas Maduro.
While sanctioning them, how is that moving a peace process? How does that move a peace process when you have sanctions and you threaten even more sanctions? Go ahead.
May I finish?
And you also threaten military action.
Let John finish.
Trump is saying all options are on the table.
Okay, let John finish. Go ahead, John.
When a democratic process is approved by Cuba, I think we have to question whether or not that process is truly democratic. So let's just put things in proper diplomatic and political context here. I think the U.S. is very much concerned about a tremendous spillover into countries in Latin America with potentially 3 million or so Venezuelan refugees, on top of the refugees that have already fled, the utter destitution of the country that has been so poorly and corruptly and fraudulently run, governed by Maduro.
Doesn't that make the situation even worse? And the more sanctions, the worse it is. Okay, I'm not going to be an apologist for the government's economic planning. I think they've made a lot of mistakes. Okay, and corruption is also there. But I mean, when you're sanctioning a country, you're intentionally hurting the average person, because you know as well as everyone else watching this program, sanctions don't really hurt the elites. It hurts the average person. And how many times, in recent memory at least, I can't think of one where the people rose up, okay, because of that. No, they usually hunker down. And that's when it gets dangerous, and that's where everything is on the table still. So can you explain to me how this tried and over again strategy ever works? Because it doesn't. Go ahead, John.
On a case-by-case basis, there's always a healthy debate to be had as to whether or not sanctions are going to be effective based on the conditions in that particular country. In Venezuela, my own sense is the reason that the Trump administration, and in many ways from a bipartisan consensus, is taking this sanctions approach, is to ensure that the people of Venezuela know that the United States is not enabling the regime of Nicolas Maduro to continue to govern that country fraudulently and corruptly.
Okay,
by starving them.
Okay, I don't understand anything.
Their own government is starving them. Their own government is starving them. Let's be honest over here.
They make sure you blockade them, you make sure there's no food, there's no medicine.
Just the way.
Okay, I'm going to go to Lou. We have 45 seconds. I want Lou to have the last word here. Please, let Lou have the last word here. Lou,
of course, the U.S. ever since President Monroe
maybe the Venezuelan government should recognize the yellow vests to become president of France. I think, given the precedent the United States has set for Venezuela, why not?
Well, I myself would like to see the yellow vest take over France, but that's a separate topic. But of course, the U.S., ever since President Monroe, has asserted control over Latin America. It controls it. And this is only the beginning, by the way. There are a lot of other countries in the Latin America the U.S. would like to overthrow their governments. The U.S. is always overthrowing governments. And one of its tools is, of course, allegedly sanctions. But the sanctions, again, yes, you're exactly right. They hurt regular people. I think that these people like Elliot Abrams enjoy hurting people. They enjoy starving people, just like the generals enjoy killing people.
Okay,
these are very unfortunate.
On that note, gentlemen, we've run out of time here. Many thanks to my guests in Washington and in Auburn. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.